Okay, I think we're live now. Once again, thank you all for coming. So the theme of this debate, the motion, is Brexit is one more step towards European disunion. So we're going to have panelists arguing for both sides of this debate. And the aim here is really for each panelist to try to convince you, based on their arguments, to kind of switch to their side. So I'm going to be telling you what Brexit is about, why it matters for the European Union, and then I'm going to basically describe what's going to happen here in the next few minutes to an hour. Okay, so Brexit is... Sorry. So in 2016, there was a vote, and this vote basically went 52 to 48 for the UK to leave the European Union. That's more or less the gist of what Brexit is. The UK is still scheduled to leave the EU on the 29th of this month. This would be the first sovereign state out of 28 to ever leave the Union. And this Brexit vote, as it's been called, has led to two different impacts. On one end, some people feel like it has strengthened the union. So the UK is known to have demanded lots of exemptions from European policies. And so perhaps the UK leaving will make the union stronger. On the other hand, we've also seen Eurosceptic parties gain increased share of the votes in some of the European Union countries. And so it's unclear if the UK leaving the Union will strengthen or weaken the European Union. This is basically the crux of the debates and why we are here today. So once again, this is an Oxford-style debate. And that means a few specific things. First of all, the motion is framed sharply in one way, as you can see. And so the motion is supported or proposed by one side. So two of our panelists will be doing that. And two of our panelists will be opposing the motion. The winner will be determined based on the group, the panelists, the team of panelists who managed to sway the most people to their arguments. And so it's really, really important for us today that you keep an open mind, regardless of where you stand on this motion currently. Okay, so this is a breakdown of what's going to be happening here. I'm currently doing the introduction. In a few moments, we're going to be having the first of two votes. And then this will be followed by opening arguments for the motion, against the motion, further arguments for the motion, against the motion. And then we're going to have 15 minutes of audience interactions. So we're going to be taking questions from you guys here and questions from Twitter. So in a moment, I will share the hashtag and also the link where your friends and family can watch this debate happening live. And then after that, we will have closing arguments for both sides and the final vote, and I will let you know who the winner is. Okay, so in just a minute, we're going to be voting. There will be three sides for each of these two votes. You can either be undecided, or you can be against, or you can be for the motion. Okay. Once again, the winner is the team that sways the most sides to their point of view. Okay, so now I hope that everyone here has a piece of paper already for the voting. a small square sheet of paper. So please write on the piece of paper if you're undecided, if you agree with the motion, or if you disagree with the motion. Just one word: undecided, agree, or disagree. So at the bottom of the screen, you can see the motion. The motion, once again, is Brexit is one more step towards European disunion. So you can be undecided, you can agree with this motion, or you can disagree with this motion. So someone will be coming around to collect your votes now, so we can do the collation. Send your votes to my right, please. Just pass them down to my right. Yeah, we'll figure it out. Okay, and once again, I would like you to get involved on Twitter. So tweet at us. We'll be taking questions from Twitter using this hashtag FDG debate. And we'll also be streaming live on YouTube. I will put up these links again in just a moment. So I will now introduce our panelists. So first of all, we have Julie Gerling here. Julie, do you mind waving? Julie is a member of the European Parliament for Southwest England and Gibraltar. She was re-elected in 2014. She currently sits on the committees for the environment, public health, and food safety, and has recently been a rapporteur for the European Union emissions trading system. Okay, so she's been gracious enough to join us here from Brussels. Can we give a round of applause, please? Thank you very much. Sorry, not Brussels, Strasbourg. And then we have Phil Eyre. Phil Eyre is a faculty member here at GEM. He's the director of our fantastic MBA program. As you can see, it's a really global program: Grenoble, Berlin, Moscow, and Georgia. He studies governance and inward FDI in France and the EU. And interestingly, Phil applied for French nationality the day after Brexit, and he's currently a dual national. Okay, we also have James Barisic. James was kind enough to come all the way from Brest. He's a business and marketing advisor based in France. Many years of experience across a range of industries. Previously worked as a lawyer, marketing and business advisor in the UK. And he also teaches digital business and social media at GEM. And thank you. And finally, we have Swaroop Rao, who is a researcher here at GEM, studies German and European energy policy, and really likes to climb and his Oxford commas. Okay, and finally, you have me. I'm your moderator. You have Josh. Josh, please wave. He's going to be handling our timing. And you have Purity, who is somewhere there tallying the votes. Okay, so right now I'm going to call the first speaker for the proposition to make his opening arguments for the motion. Phil.
Well, good afternoon. I have a very short time ahead of me just to go through a huge number of steps. So I'm going to try and include as many steps as I can because there are lots. What do we mean by disunion, first of all? Well, my interpretation is that this is the weakening of ties between sovereign states, the sovereign states that underpin the structure that is the European Union. Without the sovereign states, the European institutions will disappear very, very quickly. They depend totally on that. If I can take you back to start with to the Zurich speech of 1946, Churchill in the euphoric period of the 1940s. And he said that we must build a kind of United States of Europe. The structure, if well and truly built, will be such that the material strength of the single states will be less important. Material strength, single state. That was the vision, and I'm quoting Churchill because he was very, very aware that the biggest challenge would be to make a durable transfer of sovereignty from the nation states to these future agencies, the institutions that were to become the Commission, the Council, and the Court of Justice. But if we stand here today, what has happened? We see a wave, a tide of populism, of nationalism, of overt racism in some cases, sweeping across Europe since the period of the growth under Jacques Delors, where we saw the strengthening of the European institutions. In the last 20 years, this has gone into reverse. We see this in Hungary, Orban's Hungary. We see this with the human wall of the Czech Republic, the authoritarian Poles, and across into Sweden and Austria. And of course, they are joining the existing forces, the relabeled National Front of France, and of course the ultimate disruptor, the United Kingdom Independence Party. Why? Why this turn to populism? Well, because people are afraid. What are they afraid of? They're not just afraid of large numbers of immigrants. They are afraid of two key phenomena that have been developing rapidly: globalization, and with that, the inequalities that have been documented, not least by France's very own Piketty and the research of Milanovic. So we have evidence of rising inequality. What kind of inequality? Between people, certainly the haves and the have-nots, but more significantly within the European version of this internationalization, we have the differences, the divergence between the wealthy states and the less wealthy states. For every Germany, there is a Greece. For every Denmark or Holland, there is an Italy. Italy with debt levels of 130% of their GDP. So the second factor, which people are recognizing and therefore turning to nationalism and populism, is that we have a failure of the single market. The single market was a promise to develop converging wealth and prosperity across the Union. Instead, we see divergence. We see divergence then between the states that I have just mentioned. We see a fragmentation in economic terms between the rich and the poorer parts of Europe. The regional development funds, the cohesion policies, these have not delivered on their promise. So what else do we see? Even amongst the founder members of the original six, we see fragmentation and divergence, disunion, step by step, disunion. We have reached a level in French and Italian relations where we see that France finds it necessary to recall its ambassador from Rome. Who would have ever imagined that in a previous period? We see also France and Germany, the so-called motor for Europe of the past has definitely stalled. And if you look at the various policies that France and Germany are dealing with, they disagree on just about everything. They disagree on what to do about the resurgent Russia, about how to deal with the challenges of Trump, about what to do with Xi's China. And we see now even stronger, clear steps towards a weakening of the institutions, whereby we have France unilaterally introducing a tax on online retailing. Not a European tax, a French tax. So across the board, we have these examples. A further step towards this union is the pressure now on the European Commission, the competition commissioner, with regard to the Siemens and Alstom veto, the merger that was proposed, but was very heavily, strongly supported by France and Germany, to allow the merger to go ahead between these two European industrial giants. This was vetoed on the grounds of threat of increased monopoly, creation of monopoly. French and the German government are proposing to take away, reduce the power of the competition commissioner in this area and give it back to the nation states, more say in these decisions from the nation states. So where are we moving to? We're moving towards, well, we're moving back to the 60s in one sense. We're moving back to the EEC. Remember, originally, it was before the Union, we had the European Economic Community, as it was then. The Union only appeared in the 90s. I argue that we will be returning to the EEC, but this time it will be European Economic Cooperation. The EEC, European Economic Cooperation, on a Swiss model. The Swiss model, the Swiss government has for a number of years been very clear about their relationship, that they seek with the European Union, and that is a relationship of as much economic cooperation as possible, as little political integration as is possible. That is where the UK is with much difficulty trying to head, and that is where in the future that other states will follow. One further example of the... How much time do I have left? Huh?
None.
Oh, okay. I didn't see any flags. Oh, never mind. Okay. Okay. So, okay. Just one word to finish. Populist turn. Can it be reversed? No, it's here to stay, because globalization and inequality are set to continue. They're not about to disappear. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Phil. Okay, thank you very much, Phil. So I'm going to call on the first speaker for the opposition to present her arguments, Julie Gerling.
Thank you. I thought I was the second speaker, so there you go. So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming here to listen to me. I hope you'll find it interesting. I listened to that with interest. I think that some of the points you make are good ones, but I certainly don't agree with them all. I think one has to be very careful with the use of statistics, the use of information. For example, it is certainly true, I think, that cohesion policies have not narrowed the gap between the floor and the ceiling, but they were never designed to do that. Cohesion policies were designed to lift the floor. The fact that the ceilings moved up as well, and maybe at a slightly faster rate, doesn't negate the benefit of lifting the floor in many of the member states. Having said that, I'd just like to put some principles of European unity, which you'll imagine, for me as a British MEP, I've been thinking a lot about in the last couple of years. Just to the context, I am a strong pro-European MEP. I'm a member of the British Conservative Party, which has now decided that it's pro-Brexit. So it decided to throw me out. So I wear that badge with pride. So, just to say, Jean Monnet, who was the founding father of European potential, he observed, and I quote, "Beyond differences and geographical boundaries, there lies a common interest." And it's on that point that I reject the motion before the House. Brexit is not one more step towards disunion. On the contrary, the European Union, through common endeavour, has secured for its citizens peace, prosperity, previously unknown. And you've all lived, most of you looking at the age group here have only ever lived in that peace and prosperity, but there are many around who still remember when that was still something that we aimed for rather than had achieved. Brexit won't undermine that. It won't undermine it because it's too precious. And Brexit has its own inherent contradictions. And those inherent contradictions, I think, prove the case for Europe. So let me turn my attention first to the motion itself. With respect to the proposer, logic doesn't follow. It's a non sequitur. Ironically, and perhaps surprisingly to some here, Brexit actually has very little to do with the European Union. It's becoming painfully obvious. Put more succinctly, if we left the EU, and this is a quote, if we left the EU, we would have to recognise that most of our problems are not caused by Brussels, but by chronic British short-termism, inadequate management, sloth, low skills, a culture of easy gratification and underinvestment in both human, physical capital and infrastructure. Now, the person who said that was Boris Johnson. And yet, as you know, he's now a strong campaigner for Brexit. So don't take these people too seriously as people who have principles about Europe. They are politicians who have opportunistic eyes on the British political scene. I don't detect any sign that Brexit has undermined the drive towards a more unified Europe. Certainly not in my work as an MEP. It has, in fact, illustrated the hostility and damage that can befall even the oldest of democracies. Perhaps a better motion would have been Brexit is one more step towards British disunion. Scotland, Ireland, Wales and England face a constitutional crisis not matched in my lifetime. On the altar of Brexit, the British Union is fracturing. Both Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain in the European Union, and the main thrust of the coming independence campaign will be one of rejoining Europe. By definition, another step towards European Union. A united Ireland, which was once utterly improbable in my life, is now energised and logical and on the move. Surely this House would recognise that the youth of Europe agree with Monnet. They reject the historical divisions in favour of a common interest, the European Union. The Brits in the audience will have followed the issue closely, but let me be clear. Colleagues in the European institutions, they've had enough of us. They're looking to harness new technologies, improve security, deal with migration, tackle climate change, not sit navel-gazing in political crisis. The expedient populists around Europe who've recommended leaving cannot overcome the simple response. Look at the mess of Brexit. Why would we want to do that? It serves as a huge lesson of what happens when countries look inwards. It may push nationalists away from leaving, and I do detect that dropping off, moving towards the new European elections in many countries, some of those mentioned, Hungary, Sweden, etc. Leaving is actually dropping off their agenda. They're now talking about reforming, changing, improving. Having established that Brexit's a domestic spasm, not indicative of European disunion, let me just run through the reasons the EU remains united and extremely popular in member states. 67% of people believe that the EU has benefited their country. And if you look at Denmark, which was the second most Eurosceptic state before Brexit started, they've had a massive leap. They are now the second highest on the latest Eurostats for approval of the European Union. I think they took a look over the water and thought, what the hell? So we live in a world of globalisation, transnational threats. I understand that. A resurgent Russia and powerful China make the self-evident case for union, in my view. I see the peoples of Europe responding to that case, with or without the UK. Europe is the only rational actor that can meet the serious power blocks of the world on an equal footing and resolve significant questions. It's probable that the reach of Moscow is less acute in Lisbon, but it is precisely because Portugal is in the European Union that Warsaw can feel secure with their aggressive neighbour. United in our diversity is our slogan. The most ambitious political project since the American Civil War allows for a Europe that matters in the world. Logically and increasingly so, the Union has come to a realisation that it must have capacity to speak and project its influence directly into destabilised zones of the world. The top priority in polls of European citizens is to counter terrorism, is to look to our own security. And these threats are solved only through greater union and cooperation. I rest my case.
Thank you very much, Julie. I'll now call on the second speaker for the proposition, Swaroop Rao.
All right. Hi. Thank you. Thank you, Julie, for the speech. Okay. Phil says I need to stand up, so I will. Right. Yeah. I'm not as tall as you, clearly. Right. Thank you for the reply to Phil, and welcome to Grenoble and to our region. To Julie, I know James has been around here for a bit. In Grenoble. But nevertheless, a big welcome to Julie, to Grenoble. We hope you enjoy the hospitality of our region and, of course, the cheese and the wine. Speaking about cheese, I think it was General de Gaulle who once said, imagine how hard it is to rule a country with 250 different types of cheese. You know, and I mean, that's just France. Add the Dutch, the Swiss, the Italians with all their cheese, and not to mention the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the French, and the Italians with all their wine. You have a potential for a European war right in this room. But well, let me not make light of war. I mean, as was correctly mentioned, the conception of the European Union itself was to avoid war. That was 1950, Robert Schuman. 1957, you had the Treaty of Rome and Euratom. You had the European Economic Community, as you put it. And then we come to the big one in 1992 in Maastricht. So by then, we already see that was around the time of Margaret Thatcher, just a little bit after, in fact. And she was a Eurosceptic, by the way, as was Jeremy Corbyn back then as well, just so that you know. So I want to say Euroscepticism is not new. Nigel Farage didn't invent it, neither did Marine Le Pen. It was there way back then. All right, so then 1992 happened. Maastricht was voted, I think, by a very slim majority in the UK, I think in a referendum. So it wasn't like black and white even back then. So, and then we slowly come to 2005. Well, why 2005, you might ask? I don't know if many of you remember. I guess even I was really young as well. We had this thing called the Constitution for Europe, right? So Constitution, it's a huge thing. So it's formally and symbolically giving up a bit of your sovereignty to the supranational body. So it was a big deal. It passed in many countries with referendums, some without. Then it came to France and to the Netherlands. What happened? We all know, or maybe we don't. It was rejected by the French, 55 to 45. By the Dutch, 61 to 39. right? Don't tell me Euroscepticism is something new, no. But what happened later? Well, the European institutions, the wise men, they had a period of reflection, so to say. They said, we're going to take it down a notch, right? Cool it off for a little bit. But no, in 2007, you have the Treaty of Lisbon signed, which has the exact same provisions as the Constitution, or the proposed Constitution. What is the message that the European Union is giving to its citizens? You vote against it and we'll push it down your throats anyway, we'll do it anyway. So I'm arguing that the European Union and the European institutions lack legitimacy for the European public, for the everyday, for the average European citizen. The European institutions lack legitimacy. And as Phil was suggesting, these are the signs of a populace that is rebelling against institutions and a governance that is this neoliberal, elitist kind of institutions which serve only the haves and not the have-nots, right? Phil gave us a long list of the problems that we're having, right? In Paris, not 10 years ago, not 15 years ago, 1 week ago, last Saturday, you had, 30,000 protesters over there? Right here, if you go to Boulevard Gambetta, this Saturday, you'll find people there. They're not people like me and you here in business schools wearing coats. They're everyday people just trying to eke out a living. And they're trying to send a message, not just to President Macron, but to all the institutions that govern them, that something is not working for them, right? And we haven't heard that, or the elite, and admittedly, I'm probably one of them as well. We haven't heard that, and we're failing them in some way. The elections to the European Parliament are barely 2 months away. Does anyone know what the voter turnout was last time? 43%. I open Le Monde Diplomatique of this month, front page, first article about the elections, saying how apathetic we are, the voters are. So it's not an isolated situation. The populism didn't come out of a vacuum. But it's easy to kick at someone and laugh when they're down, right? I'm proud of what we've achieved as the European Union in the past 70 years. I'm proud to be part of this. So I don't propose that we just dissolve it all the way. We need to save what we have. All the good things that Julie mentioned is we need to reform the European Union and the institutions. And the way is probably similar to what Phil was suggesting: bring back more power to the national governments and to national institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Swaroop. Now I'll call James to deliver further arguments for the opposition.
Hello, everyone, and thank you to Phil and Swaroop for proposing the motion. I've got a lot to get through. I've got 74 years of peace to get through, and if that's not one sentence that wins this argument, I don't know what is. Looking at just two things that Swaroop mentioned, and I think they probably bear commenting on, this idea that Thatcher was a Eurosceptic. She was at the end. She was against everything at the end, having criticised Ted Heath for sitting on the backbenches and moaning. Having left office, she sat on the backbenches, and then she sat in the Lords and she moaned a lot, and she ditched all the things that she thought she believed in, like free trade. Thatcher was no Eurosceptic. She was at the forefront of the campaign to join the European community as then was. She was right at the front of it. And she was the architect of the single market. That she decided to be against everything that the people that followed her believed in was, I think, for more domestic purposes than anything else. And on this idea of the fact that Maastricht was rejected and then represented to the people, and what is the message of that to European institutions, the message of that to the people from European institutions surely has to be that we are a mature enough democracy to be allowed to think again, that we can reflect and think. And changes were made because they weren't the exact same documents. And the changes were made in response to the questions that were asked when they were rejected. And that's no bad thing. So when I was putting my thoughts together for this debate, the first thing that came to my mind was this idea of a democratic deficit. The European Union is a union of people as much as a union of nations. And to me, it's the union, that union of people, that's the most important thing. Now, however pro-European you are, you would have to be bordering on the delusional not to recognise that Europe, especially in the last 10 years or so, has singularly failed to maintain, strengthen, or even create, in some circumstances, strong links with its citizens. Many politicians have recognised it, but there's been a level of arrogance in some quarters that's led to nothing really being done to correct it. Brexit is the wake-up call. Brexit is the manifestation of the failure of Europe to talk directly to swathes of the population who feel increasingly remote from politics at all levels. And for exposing that, we should thank the British. Because for all the suffering that they are about to impose on themselves through their own bizarre choice, they've given the strongest message that the EU has to engage properly and fully with its European citizens, wherever they are on the political spectrum. Indeed, President Macron's recent Dear Europe letter addresses this very point by reaching out directly to citizens and questioning the Europe that we want for our future. This approach of reaching out is anathema to the central plank of the far right and the far left, who, in my mind, are two cheeks of the same bum, if I may use that analogy. Their accusation that Europe is remote can be true, but it can also be changed in a moment by reaching out and listening and talking. In that spirit of democracy and reaching out, I decided to ask Twitter users in Europe what they think, because at the end of the day, they can't be here. And on this side, at least, we're nothing if not hugely democratic. And I'd like to thank them, if they're watching, for their contributions. And as I looked through all the responses, I was struck by how they revolved around only a few key themes. The first was that if there is to be an existential crisis, as Juliet said, it's a crisis for the Union of the United Kingdom rather than the EU. Rick MacSpeed, I'm going to be reading out tweets for part of this, was one of many to make the point that it's the EU who will provide a safe harbour for Scotland and Northern Ireland as they cede from the UK after Brexit. And that leads us on to another hugely important question. As you watch the UK destroy the very fabric of its own country, is that what you really want to wish upon your own country? Is leaving worth the destruction of something that you say you hold dear? Richard Bentall tweeted to say, Brexit will make the EU stronger. It will vividly demonstrate the harmful effects of leaving and at the same time remove the most cantankerous, obstructive element from their midst. I've long wondered why EU politicians don't see Brexit as in their interest. The issue in the UK won't go away for decades. In the short term, expect the emergence of a growing pro-EU movement in Britain. Longer term, there's a good chance of Scotland moving to the EU, all to the good of the EU. Now, many of us on the pro-EU side were privately scared that the EU 27 could fail to find a united front and stick to it through 2 years of negotiations. And that's been the main test of how Europe would react to the crisis. Tom Scott on Twitter observed that the EU is as much an idea as it is a set of institutions and laws. It isn't defined by the totality of its membership, but by the common ground between them. That doesn't disappear when the UK leaves any more than it does when others join. And what common ground? 2 years and not a word out of place from 27 EU countries. As I sat last night desperately wondering how to finish this speech, and I'm conscious of the waving arm, I thought, please, someone send me a sign. Send me something that would perfectly illustrate to this British-born Croat married in Iceland to a Welsh woman with a son born in England and a daughter born in France, speaking at a French business school, drinking French wine. Send me a sign. And nothing came. So I looked for one last tweet, and I picked one from Jean Hood, and it read, the countries of the EU are forming trade blocs for protection and negotiating power, and the EU is the largest of them. Not one of the 27 will want to be standing naked and shivering before the aggressive and economic and deregulation demands of the EU, of the US and China. And I thought, that's not bad, but can I just make one very, very quick point? I thought, that's not bad, and my phone beeped, and one of my friends sent me a tweet. And the tweet was from the disgraced former Defence Secretary and now International Trade Secretary Liam Fox, and it started, I've got that much left, I'll be very quick. It started, signed a trade agreement today with Pacific Islands, which will avoid around £19 million of tariff duties on UK imports from Fiji and Papua New Guinea. 19 million quid. In the last few months, £1 trillion of capital have left the UK. And the UK is getting excited about 19 million quid in the week that the Euro Millions jackpot is £70 million.
Thank you.
And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, James. So right now we're going to move on to you guys. You guys get the opportunity to ask questions to whoever you want to on the panel. Each member of, if you are asked a question, each member of the panel will have 1 minute to answer the question. So just brief responses. I'm sorry, that's the best we can do. Does anybody have a question? Please just raise your hand if you do. Does anybody have a question from? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to pass the microphone to you. Can you pass this down?
So hello. I have a question for Mr. Barisic. I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name. So you said that Brexit. I mean, I didn't understand how Brexit will make the EU stronger. If you could explain that a bit.
I think... Hello? I think fundamentally, when you are in a position of watching a country destroy itself, you have to wonder whether that's a good idea. When you watch a country losing... So the economy of the UK is predominantly based around financial services. That money, £1 trillion of capital, has left the UK and it's come to the EU. That's a vote of confidence in the EU. And we can look at that and we can decide what we want for our countries, whether we want to be part of this bloc that actually is a powerhouse in the world in economic terms and can stand against large economic blocs and negotiate as equals, or whether we want to be the country that destroys itself and gets excited about a trade agreement with Fiji, with no disrespect to Fiji, and gaining 19 million euros. And I think that the idea that we can look at that and say this is bad is part of what makes this union stronger.
Thank you very much, James. Does anyone from the proposition want to say something to this regard? Okay, so
I'd just like to point out that, throughout what James was speaking, I kept wondering whether he was batting for the wrong side. I think halfway through, I was thinking, okay, he's doing half the work for us. But I'm just joking. I mean, Nothing against you, James.
I think fundamentally, we've got one of the issues with this debate is that those of us that were on the pro-EU side in the past have quite happily stood up and said everything's perfect. Everything isn't perfect, but we've got to look at the realities of what's out there and say we have to improve this. And until we get to the stage where we can say there are issues here and we could make it much worse, we're not going to get anywhere. We're not going to get anywhere by saying everything's perfect. Do you want to say everything's perfect? No.
Thank you very much. We have one question from Mary on Twitter. If Brexit leaving makes the EU stronger, what happens to the economic prosperity of the other countries in the EU? What stops Germany from leaving and causing similar issues to Russia and the Middle East countries? So I will let the proposition start with the response. Does anyone?
Well, no, that's a valid. That's definitely a valid point. That it could be, it could lead the way. That if Brexit finally goes ahead, and in the years to come, not immediately, in the longer term, we reach that kind of those sunny uplands that the Brexiters have been promising for a number of months. Then clearly, yes, it goes back to the point made earlier. That we see this economic fragmentation, divergence rather than convergence. And the question could be posed, and in fact was posed during the Greek crisis, so with regard to Italy, from the opposite side of the fence, the question of whether Germany will still, in the future, see reason to stay as the main financier of Europe, to be subsidizing many countries that have much lower prosperity. That is definitely true. Why should Germany stay?
Thank you very much, Phil.
Very quickly to add that, why will they have an incentive to leave? Because the pie is getting smaller.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, the UK, which is the third largest country, is leaving, so everything's getting smaller.
Thank you very much. Does someone from the opposition have anything to add? Or deduct?
Well, all I would say is that the idea of Germany choosing to leave the European Union strikes me as a fantasy that's even perhaps more unicorn-related than Brexit. Certainly in the foreseeable future, they gain far too much for it. Europe is about to hit a bit of an economic wall, particularly the Trump-induced war with China economically is not good for Europe, certainly not good for Germany. I acknowledge that. And the only way in which we're going to be able to weather that storm is by sticking together in a union. And I see absolutely no prospect that Germany will sort of sail off and decide that it's better off without its massive, what is in effect its massive domestic market. So I think those things are an awfully long way away. From a British point of view, I would simply say, and I don't wish this upon us, but my view is that Brexit is an absolute disaster. And we've only seen the tip of that iceberg at the moment. And as you go through the next few years after we've left, I think it will be such a huge disincentive to any of the other member states. You're not going to see any movement for a long time.
Thank you very much, Julie. We have another question from the audience.
Yes, this could be to either Julie Girling or James Barisic. You were talking about how the UK is kind of tearing itself apart. Right here. You were talking about how the UK is kind of tearing itself apart around the question of Brexit. But seeing how UK specific the problems it's facing are with its relationships to Scotland and Northern Ireland, can we really say that Brexit would discourage other countries from leaving the EU? I don't know if that was very clear.
Yes, so I think the disintegration of the United Kingdom won't happen tomorrow. It'll be a slow process over the next several years. So I don't expect other countries in the European Union to immediately see an analogy with themselves. So that's just one small thing, but some of the other disadvantages of Brexit actually, there are so many small things that they add up in total to so much. You've no idea how many of my constituents have written to me to ask what's going to happen to their dog, because they are concerned about taking their dog on holiday. Many Brits have second homes on the continent. They constantly move their pets with them 3, 4, 5 times a day. This is a European Union pet passport, which will not be available to the UK as a third country. This has distressed more of my constituents than anything else. So, and that is one of hundreds and hundreds of small inconveniences that come on top of the big economic disadvantages. And as people realise them, they get more and more distressed. So I don't know how fond the French are of their dogs, but maybe if they look at the UK and then they find that they can't take their dog to the UK, or if they leave, they can't take their dog to Germany, maybe that's the clincher for them. Politics is about small things that add up to totals.
Thank you very much, Julie.
Can I just add one thing? I think part of the issue with the breakdown of the UK is going to come about through the pressures on public services from a lot of European citizens leaving the EU. And that is because Scotland and England are so culturally different. Scotland has no issue at all with immigration. It has no issue with European citizens being in the UK. England does. And they won't take kindly to having their public services decimated by having no staff. England will come to that same conclusion, but slower.
Thank you very much, James. Does someone want to add something from the proposition? No. Okay, do we have any other questions from the audience?
Hello. Do you think that Scotland's position on Brexit could affect the UK, the British policies, economic policies in the future?
I think the short answer to that is yes, because the more tension you see between London and Edinburgh, the more the tension creates its own tensions within government. So you're probably going to see, although there is a formula that in terms of public spending called the Barnett formula that ensures that there are relatively similar amounts of spending both sides of the border. That to one side, there is other money that gets spent around the country, and the more tensions that you get between London and Edinburgh, the more chance there are that money is going to end up being spent in England and create other issues for Scotland. Scotland will end up being pushed out through the pig-headedness of London and the fact that London wants to rip Scotland out of a union that it wants to stay in. The fact that they end up taking money and public services out of Scotland, which will inevitably happen, is just going to push that forward, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, James. Do we have anything from the proposition?
Just quickly, the case of Scotland is a complex one, as James said. In many ways, there is a threat to the finance, but Scotland is definitely financially reliant on London. What could happen in the future is that possibly there could be a split, and Scotland, as was mentioned earlier, could perhaps exit from the UK and then apply for European membership. But what kind of membership would they have? Going back to previous points, and this is the case with Brexit, that it looks quite likely or possible that the UK is moving towards a compromise in the coming months and may possibly wish to stay within the customs union and the single market. So what kind of Europe are we heading towards? One of variable geometry, fragmentation. Scotland may well find itself in a similar position. So what we see in the current position with Norway, which is only partially connected, we may see that in the future. So that again would be further steps towards disunion.
Thank you very much, Phil. I think we have time for one more question. Does anybody have a question?
What do you think will be the impact on the participation rate of the election?
Well, it depends. If you mean a European election in the UK, there isn't going to be one. Unless, or do you mean in the rest of Europe? In the rest of Europe, I suspect it will be relatively small. The irony of being a member of the European Parliament is that you quickly realise that the elections that you get elected in bear little resemblance to the work that you do for the next 5 years, because they're almost always, in every member state, fought on domestic issues. And members get terribly excited about certain things and they think it's going to make a big difference in Croatia, something that's happening in Brussels. It rarely does. Now, this is a big issue. Obviously, the UK leaving is a big political issue, which does register, I think, in the electorates of the other 27. Quite what they make of it, I couldn't really judge, and it will be different in each country. So some may take the view, Spain, for example, which has a disproportionate interest in Gibraltar, which I represent, may have the Parti Popular may make something of Brexit and therefore increase participation a little bit. But I don't think it will be a massive difference in turnout.
Thank you very much, Julie. Does anyone want to add something from the proposition?
Very quickly, I think that only serves to underline our point that the EU and its institutions are losing legitimacy in the minds of the citizenry. Right, 43% was that was in 2014. Maybe even lesser this time. Who knows? But people are caring lesser and lesser, and that spells doom for the European Union. That's one more step towards disunion, unless we do something about it and reform it.
Thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you to all of you here and on Twitter for your very interesting questions. I will now call Phil Eyre to deliver the closing arguments for the proposition.
Okay, thank you. So, where's the microphone? Thank you very much. So, okay. In conclusion, from this side, yes, I think from what was just said, there is a risk, even though I would agree with Julie that Brexit will be economically disastrous. Nevertheless, it appears that Brexit is going to go ahead in some shape or form. We don't quite know what, but it will. There will be a Brexit, and this will, even if there are economic issues, it will be a strong signal to all those parties across Europe that are preaching Euroscepticism, to demonstrate that even a major, highly integrated country that has been part of Europe for 40 years or more is able to, painfully, it's true, to part company. And of course, it's always the first mover that goes through an experience that has never been gone through before, a fully integrated or almost fully integrated country, not part of the euro, obviously, that decides to move out. So it will encourage further steps in other parts of Europe in the future. That is quite possible. The other issue really is, where is this, since the word reform has been mentioned, where is this full reform going to come from? We have two major problems in terms of the position and the relationship of the European institutions with the European citizens. We have the problem of the question of representativeness. If we have citizens that are focused on national elections rather than on the European Parliament elections, that means there is a question mark, as my colleague said, over the legitimacy of the European institutions. And secondly, the Commission, the Council, these are also seen as part of the elitist problem. So when we have the Gilets jaunes in France, the yellow jackets, it would be interesting to ask the question, how many of the Gilets jaunes are going to be supporting European integration in elections, either nationally or indeed in the European elections, because the kind of concerns they have, the criticisms they have, are also reflected in this concern about elitism and the growing inequality that we see at different levels. So the other area in terms of questioning the togetherness, the links, the cohesion between European member states and the support and the guarantee for the future of the European institutions is the question of foreign policy. What foreign policy? One of the big areas then of which is keeping the European nations apart, the national governments apart, is that we do not have, effectively, we do not have European foreign policy. It's decided at national level. We have seen this go back to the conflicts, various conflicts, for example, in ex-Yugoslavia. We had very different positions from Germany, from France, from Britain, and in that conflict. We have a high representative for foreign affairs, but who is noticeably shining by her absence on the front of the international scene. When we have a foreign policy issue, it is notable that it's the national leaders that are to the fore, and we don't really have any European togetherness. So I would argue, in conclusion, that if Churchill was here now, he would have to put aside his optimism and recognize that his dream of 1946 has not come to pass, has not come to be, and the kind of less importance of the individual states is not going to happen either now or in the future.
Thank you very much, Phil. You have just heard closing arguments for the proposition. Now I will call Julie to deliver closing arguments for the opposition.
Thank you. Well, of course, the proposition talks about one more step towards, and we haven't really addressed that issue. One more step. What steps are they that this is the next step towards disunion? And I don't believe that we've heard proven at all that the European Union is moving in the opposite direction of unity. It doesn't mean to say integration necessarily on an economic or political level, but unity is about having a common purpose. It's about having a common feeling. It's about having things in common. And I see nothing in Brexit that will make that less of an issue for Europe. In fact, as I think we've proven, quite the opposite. Ever closer union? Yeah, maybe not. But we haven't got a completely integrated European Union anyway. I don't think that the peoples of Europe have yet decided whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. We all have different views on that. European elections, yes, the turnout's relatively low, but not actually that much lower than federal elections, for example, in the US, which have existed for, actually almost centuries on turnouts of around 50%. Now, I don't hold them up as a bastion of good governance, don't get me wrong, but what I'm saying is they are a strong democracy, and the turnout in an election, if it's low, can sometimes be an expression of satisfaction. Consider that. So I think it's true that the UK has been a little disruptive within the European Union, usually quite positively, actually, because sometimes the UK has been good at pointing out where actually maybe one shouldn't go there and it would be better to opt out. I don't agree that the European Union has no place on the international stage. It's eyeing very, very jealously the seat of the UK on the UN Security Council, and it would dearly like to take it away. So, in fact, the UK leaving might make that a much more realistic prospect. But then again, speaking in France, I don't know how the French would feel about losing their seat on that either. So Every country has its own domestic priorities, but that hasn't stopped the EU from being a strong force on the global scene. It really hasn't stopped Europeans from increasing their prosperity, increasing their standard of living over the years, increasing the level of integration that we have in a beneficial way, but without losing our national identities and our senses of being part of our domestic country first and then European. And I don't believe that we've heard anything today that would suggest that the UK going will be anything other than a positive force towards the other 27 member states continuing with their strong and close cooperation, their strong and close feeling of a European identity, and indeed moving forward, being able to be part of this whole globalization scene as a strong and cohesive bloc. So I guess I ought to say, as a Brit, I wish you all the best of luck with that. But I'm still hoping we might still manage to pull it off that we don't leave. So I hope you'll wish us the best of luck with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julie. So now you have heard arguments from both sides of the debate. I will now ask you to vote again. Please let us know if you are still undecided. If you now agree with the motion, or if you now disagree with the motion. Once you vote, please pass your votes to my right. That's this way. So once again, thank you all for coming. In a few moments, I will let you know who won this debate. I just want to thank our panelists once again for taking time from their busy schedules and traveling all the way here. Also those who live here to be part of this debate. Thank you all once again for being such an awesome audience. If you're watching us live, thank you too. And thank you to everyone I've been working on this with. Thank you to Josh. Thank you to Purity over there. So yes, please, once again, when you vote, pass your votes to my right. And we will let you know in a moment how this debate has gone. In the meantime, if you have... Okay, so voting is now closed. If you have any other questions, just for the sake of it, while our panelists are still here, I will be taking your questions now.
I have a question for Ms. Girling. Perhaps you could explain what might be the future for Gibraltar. Perhaps you have some information for us.
Well, the situation for Gibraltar is very difficult. Gibraltar is not a fully integrated member of the EU, actually, as it stands now, because they're not part of the customs union, the single market. So, and they have a very interesting and unique constitutional position within the UK system. But they do leave when the UK leaves. And they've built an economy in Gibraltar which relies heavily on something like 12,000, 13,000 people a day. Bear in mind the population of Gibraltar is only 35,000, so that's a third of its population on a daily basis coming in and out to work. And that's a mixture of jobs at the lower end of the economy, people cleaning the toilets in the hospital, etc. And then at the top end, a lot of digital employment. And they cannot function without that. So the future is very bleak in terms of the border, because everyone talks about the Irish border and a little bit about Dover and Calais, but actually there is another border there. And it's already a bit of a political football occasionally. And the way in which that works is that the Guardia Civil will, on occasion, simply just completely slow down the movement across that border to the point where the economy grinds to a halt for a few days, just to show that they can. And I suspect that that will increase once the UK has left. There has been no special deal done for Gibraltar. There have been a lot of assurances from the UK government that they will not be abandoned, but no detail, certainly none that's public, on how that will be achieved. So, yeah, I think times are going to be very tough for Gibraltar. But then Gibraltar's got some questions of its own. I mean, Gibraltar chooses, for example, not to charge excise duties on alcohol and cigarettes. So that creates almost inevitably a demand from people living in Spain. They like to go over and either buy them or, some say, not buy them and smuggle them back. This is a thorn in the relationship side, so maybe Gibraltar will have to think again about those things. Personally, I believe any modern country that doesn't try by fiscal means to stamp out smoking is actually being irresponsible, and I don't think they should continue with no excise on cigarettes, but that's just my view. So we'll see, maybe those things will have to change. But it's not good. There is no clear view from my perspective of what will happen with Gibraltar.
Thank you very much, Julie.
Just very quickly, on the question of Gibraltar, since we are here in a geopolitics festival, Gibraltar is a wonderful example. If anybody familiar with Tim Marshall's text, Prisoners of Geography, the Gibraltarians are no prisoners of geography. You see here demographics taking precedence over the geographical logic. If you look at the map, it's very clearly physically part of Spain, but in cultural terms, for 300 years, very, very British.
Thank you very much, Phil. So at the start of this debate, we had just hold on a minute. Okay, so at the start of this debate, we recorded 99 votes in total. 47 people agreed. 47 people agreed. 31 people disagreed. And 21 people were undecided. After the debate, we have 18 people agree with the motion, 14 people are undecided, and 59 people disagree with the motion. And so we have successfully cancelled Brexit. So our winner today is the opposition. So we in this house declare that Brexit is not one step, it's not one more step towards European disunion. So there you have it. Thank you very much for coming. And thank you once again to our panelists.